Okay, we're going to talk about the context of the 1920s here. And during this time period, we have essentially two main presidents that we're going to be discussing, Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge. Warren G. Harding is elected, and then he serves for a term, and he dies in office, and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, takes over. And so they are the presidents through most of the 1920s. And we see here, we're coming out of World War One. We're coming out of the progressive era, and these are Republican presidents that kind of want to return back to kind of the way things were previously during the Gilded Age, and they want it to be a time of peace, and they also want it to be a time for business. So we see in this cartoon here, we see kind of a New Year's kind of thing. We see the old year, and it says 1921 says, "I must stop here, son. I couldn't quite reach it, so I'll turn the job over to you. Now make good." So 1922, and we have the sign that says normalcy, right? This idea of return to normalcy, coming back to kind of a normal life after the kind of chaos of the World War One era. So some terms and people you should know. You should be aware of this term Red Scare. This is during the 1920s, and a red being a color associated with communism. And there was this fear of a communist revolution because there had been a Russian revolution where the communists took over. And this led to a kind of distrust of immigrants and restrictions on people's constitutional rights, which we sometimes call civil liberties. And the Palmer raids are kind of an example of what happened during the Red Scare. These are the Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer. He used the federal government and agents, what would become the FBI later on, to search for communists. They didn't really find very much, but or really anything at all. But they did deport a lot of people, and they kind of arrested people without warrants and put people in jail without allowing them to talk to the lawyer, kind of violating those constitutional rights. I mentioned earlier the slogan "Return to Normalcy." This is a campaign slogan for Warren Harding. This was this idea that it promised like a time of peace after World War One, no more progressive ideas of kind of turning the society upside down and trying to reform everything, and also to kind of keep government out of business. That was kind of the normalcy from his point of view. And so this laissez-faire idea, which is like ending government intervention in business, that the government shouldn't step in and make any laws to regulate business, let businesses do what they want, set their own wages, prices, that kind of thing. It's a very different kind of thing from what was happening during World War One and the progressive era. And finally, we have isolationism, which is a foreign policy, which is a kind of belief that, let the rest of the world sort their problems out. The United States is kind of going to be doing on its own, and not in a in a group way like the League of Nations did. Okay, so let's talk about the Red Scare a little bit more. So I mentioned earlier the Russian Revolution turned Russia into this communist country, and the United States was a capitalist nation. Communism is kind of seen as the opposite of that, right? In capitalism, people can make as much money as they want. They're free to do what they want in terms of their jobs, that sort of thing. Whereas communism was seen as much more strict, much more regimented, where the government kind of was telling you what to do all the time. You also had but there was a growing segment of people because of the income inequality, the poor wages and working conditions, that kind of thing. There was kind of a socialist movement or communist movement happening in America. And Eugene Debs, who you might remember from the Pullman strike, he was a socialist leader. He was put in jail. And people were protesting against that. There were also these kind of mail bombs that were sent to different buildings around the country. And there was a kind of this fear of like maybe there was going to be a violent revolution in America. So in 1919, so it's right before the 1920s, A. Mitchell Palmer created this task force to investigate the bombings, right? And the most of the targets were worker organizations, kind of like unions, because unions were associated with socialism and communism. And you had immigrant groups, particularly ones from Southern and Eastern Europe. They made 6,000 arrests, but found no evidence of any kind of conspiracy. And these were later criticized for kind of ignoring people's rights. And we see in this cartoon here, you see it has A. Mitchell Palmer out for a stroll. So he's taking a walk, and he looks around him. What does he see around him? He sees all these people on their clothes. It says Reds as communists here. So he sees communists everywhere, even if they're not really there. So he's kind of seeing them hiding in the ground. He sees them, when they aren't necessarily all there. Meanwhile, everybody else is just kind of casually strolling in the park. All right, so they're talking about the Harding administration, Warren G. Harding. One of the things that's associated with Harding is this idea of corruption and scandal. So he promised this return to normalcy, but what happened was a lot of scandals that happened in his administration, the most famous of which is the Teapot Dome scandal, which was his Secretary of the Interior took bribes and kind of like made it so that easier for oil companies to drill on kind of federal land. And so even though he promises return to normalcy, like people saw a lot of scandal and corruption. It also came out that he had a child with a woman who wasn't his wife. It was very scandalous, right? He eventually dies in office, and his vice president, Calvin Coolidge, kind of took over. These are two very different men. Coolidge was very serious and reserved. He was nicknamed Silent Cal because he was so kind of like, reserved. And whereas Harding was a little more outgoing. And so Coolidge was a strong believer in laissez-faire economics, which is, he has this quote here: the chief business, so the main business of the American people is business. So he's saying that business is the most important thing we do in the United States. Okay, so he really emphasized giving power to business. And there's this famous story that with his nickname Silent Cal, somebody said to him, "I bet someone else that I could get you to say more than two words." And of course, he responds with two words, not more than two words. You lose, right? So that's kind of the story of Silent Cal. Kind of shows how he acted. And we have this cartoon here. We have these businessmen standing around a cash register, opening the cash register, so making lots of money. This is the cash register chorus. So they're singing the song about what a friend we have in Coolidge. This really emphasizes Coolidge's laissez-faire ideas. He was a real friend to business. He wanted to let business kind of do whatever they want. And then down here we have this, you see the teapot, right, and oil, right? That's a reference to the Teapot Dome scandal. And we see the White House highway. So we see this is showing corruption, like from the Harding administration. Okay, so with Harding, we see associated with corruption. Coolidge, we associate with laissez-faire. Okay, economic and foreign policies here. So when we talk about general economic policies, I mentioned laissez-faire, right? And this is what laissez-faire really looks like when it comes to government. It's lower taxes so that people, if their people are paying less in taxes, that means they have more money that they can spend in the economy, or businesses can use to invest and hire more people or expand their businesses. The idea that if you cut taxes, then that will kind of create this economic growth. Lowering government spending, so less government spending. Now, World War One was over. There was no need for military spending, that kind of thing. So, kind of cutting government spending down. And then, lastly, the World War One allies, so Britain, France, those kind of countries, they were in debt, and they owed the United States money because remember, the United States, they gave a lot of supplies and money to help with World War One. And so, because all these countries owed the United States was kind of this world economic power now at the end of World War One. So these laissez-faire economic policies were a desire to grow the nation's economy. Okay, when it comes to foreign policies, it's not exactly the same as laissez-faire, but in some ways it is, in the sense that the United States was kind of didn't want to get involved with too many other countries, so they refused to be part of the League of Nations. Remember, that was part of the Treaty of Versailles at the end of World War One, and the U.S. Senate refused to ratify it. So rather than joining with other nations as part of the League of Nations, what they decided to do is they decided to kind of go it alone and negotiate individual agreements with other countries. So we have the Dawes Plan, which would help Germany pay the reparations that they owed after the Treaty of Versailles to Britain and France, so that Britain and France could pay back the United States. So it's kind of the cycle of money kind of flowing through the world economy. We have this five-power treaty, which kind of limited construction of battleships so that we didn't have a kind of this rise of militarism that had in part caused World War One. And then finally, the Kellogg-Brianne Pact. This was an agreement that basically attempted to outlaw wars, right, with this idea to secure a peaceful future. And we see in this cartoon here, we see Uncle Sam, he's visiting Paris, right? And it says new peace passed, and then Uncle Sam's visiting, and then we see this baby here, the League of Nations, and he's calling him Pa, so he's calling Uncle Sam Dad because remember Woodrow Wilson was the American president who came up with the League of Nations, and we see Europe here, and then we see Brianne, the Kellogg-Brianne Pact here. So he's kind of shocked, like that's not my baby, right? So he's kind of denying the existence of this thing that he helped create. Okay, so those kind of wrap up the context of the 1920s. We have fear of communism, we have the growth of American business, and we have America kind of like staying out of getting too involved in other countries around the world.